Hello wonderful person, this is Anton and I'm here with Richard Branson. Okay, not really, but I wish I was. And you may have already heard that Virgin Galactic was able to finally reach the edge of space using their beautiful craft that you see right here. Now, here's the thing though, not everyone agrees with what they've actually reached. Not everyone agrees that they actually went to space, and let me actually talk a little bit about the definitions of space in this video and give you an idea of what we actually are currently kind of arguing and discussing about. So the actual craft that you see right here, or you'll see in a few seconds, reached the altitude of about 83 kilometers. I believe the actual exact altitude was 51.4 miles or 82.7 kilometers, which is just ironic because so-called Kármán line, which is essentially the line that divides space and the atmosphere, is set slightly above that. So in some sense, not everyone would agree that this particular craft actually reached space. Now let me talk a little bit more about the details, and as a matter of fact, you can actually find a lot of this on Wikipedia. Starting with this little image that shows you the actual various layers of atmosphere here, starting with troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, that ends at around 85 kilometers. And according to most international definitions, Kármán line actually sort of starts, or I guess is, at 100 kilometers, which is where space begins. So space begins after about 100 kilometers, which is just over 61 miles, I think. In other words, by these standards, this craft didn't really make it to space. But there is actually a very recent paper that argues that Kármán line would not really be that high. As a matter of fact, the paper that you can find in the link in the description below argues that if you revisit the calculations and analysis of Kármán line using modern standards, it really should be somewhere around 80 to 90 kilometers. And the way that they argue about this is that if you basically look at all of the satellites orbiting our planet, once in a while some satellites, especially the ones with very eccentric orbits, actually go into altitudes of about 90 kilometers or even 80 kilometers if they need to, for example, change their orbit, or in some cases they'll actually use the Earth's atmosphere to kind of change the trajectory of their orbit as well. So in some sense, it's as if they entered and exited space at will. So it doesn't really make sense. How can a satellite be in space and then not be in space? So that's one sort of way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is by actually defining what space is and what atmosphere is, and maybe even going to the original definition by Kármán himself. And this is him, Theodor Kármán, the Hungarian-American aerospace engineer who essentially defined Kármán line, or technically he didn't really name it, it was named by one of the first lawyers that dealt with aerospace matters, and essentially this line was defined as a line where the air itself is so thin that it can no longer provide any lift to the craft, and the only way for a craft to actually maintain its, I guess, orbit in this sense is to actually use orbital velocity. So in other words, wings become kind of useless. And so the most exact sort of definition of Kármán line currently stands at around 83.6 kilometers, which is ironically, and I guess kind of sadly, is literally about 500 meters above to where this craft was just a few days ago from when I'm making this video. So in other words, as of today, according to, I guess, more specific definitions, Kármán line was actually not reached by Virgin Galactic. In other words, these astronauts didn't really make it to space just yet. Although, according to NASA's traditions, anyone who reaches altitudes of over 80 kilometers has unofficially become an astronaut. Now, this tradition was actually followed since the early 60s, when these beautiful birds used to fly quite regularly. This is the super famous X-15 experimental craft that was used by a lot of famous astronauts, including Neil Armstrong himself, that was mostly used for training purposes, but also for experimental purposes to see the effects of space and zero Gs on human bodies. And the way that this craft was launched is very similar to how Virgin Galactic is doing it. It was actually attached to a very large B-52 bomber, and this was called the mothership, and it was then released from the wing of the B-52. and right here you can see it separating from there, and then flew up into the space, and most of these craft actually reached altitudes of over 80 kilometers, and some even reached altitudes of over 100 kilometers. And even today, this craft actually still holds the record for the fastest ever speed achieved, and was an absolute marvelous creation like from 50 years ago. So it's kind of insane how advanced our space technology was back in the days, and we're finally now kind of trying to recreate what was achieved decades ago. Now, that's not to say that Virgin Galactic failed here. As a matter of fact, this was a huge success, and we think that in the next few weeks they'll probably reach the altitude of 100 kilometers, because that's kind of how this craft is designed to operate. It's actually designed to go to a much higher altitude. And I'm sure most people will not actually disagree that these two pilots totally deserve being named the first commercial astronauts. But at this point, after this particular launch, I think many people will actually doubt that they actually reached space after all. Compared to the insane and incredible launches of X-15 crafts back in the 60s, Virgin Galactic is almost there, and they're almost ready to launch commercial flights as well, but still not quite there. They still need to perfect the actual launches, and they still need to make sure the actual safety is there as well. But it's also very likely that by the end of next year, 2019, we'll most likely have our first commercial launch with actual clients on board. So we're probably almost there. Well, anyway, so on this, I guess, somewhat critical and maybe somewhat cynical note, I'm going to stop this video here and show you some of the coolest shots from this particular launch. I personally think they definitely deserve being named astronauts, and I definitely think we need to maybe requalify Kármán line as being slightly lower than it currently is. 100 kilometers is just, it kind of doesn't make sense, it's just a round number. But whether they actually reached the Kármán line according to Kármán himself, the answer to that is no. They were literally just a few hundred meters or like 1,000 feet short, which is really sad because they almost made it. But anyway, so on this note, I'm going to stop this video here, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you for joining me, and maybe even consider subscribing to this channel if you still haven't. Share this video with someone who loves learning about space and wants to learn through simulations and video games, and come back tomorrow to learn something else you may have not known before. Once these guys succeeded being even higher than they were, we'll talk about this again in one of the future videos, but for now, that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you for watching, space out, and as always, bye-bye.